Two strangers entered Sodom at dusk, and every dog near the gate stopped barking. By morning, the city was gone. Eliab had watched that gate for 40 years, and he noticed it at once. In this city, nothing stayed quiet without a reason. Not the animals, not the alleys, not the people. Even silence usually made a sound here. But that evening, it lay flat. The two men came without animals, without servants, without goods. Dust clung to their clothes, but not the exhaustion of the road. Nothing about them looked worn down. Nothing about them looked lost. It was as if the road had touched them and taken nothing. And that did not belong in Sodom. The city lay low beside the salt sea, pressed into a plain of stone, clay, and dust. In the day, it held the heat. At night, it gave back cold. Wind ran along the walls and sometimes carried salt into the streets. Sometimes something else. A smell no one named out loud. Eliab knew every hour of that city. He knew the merchants with clean beards and honest prices who sent men into dark courtyards after sunset. He knew the families who shut their doors before a cry for help could come twice. He knew the faces of men who spoke of order in daylight and decided at night who deserved protection and who did not. Sodom was not openly cruel. That was the worst thing about it. Its cruelty did not arrive shouting. It arrived as habit, in glances, in locked doors, in the way people no longer flinched when something happened in a side street that should never have lasted until morning. Then the strangers stopped just inside the gate. The first lifted his eyes toward the roofs. The second looked past Eliab into the alley as if he already knew what lived there. Eliab took half a step forward. "Stay outside," he said quietly. Not because the plane was safer, because out there at least, anything that wanted to kill you did it in the open. The older man gave no answer. No thanks, no protest. He only looked at Eliab, and then both of them walked past him. In that moment, Eliab felt something cold at the back of his neck. Not fear, not yet. Just the knowledge that the city had already reacted before anything had happened. Near the well, a dog in the shadow lifted its head. It looked at the two men. It did not bark. Then it backed away, tail low, and disappeared between two walls with a soft whine. The dogs were silent. At first, that could still be explained. Cold, fatigue, wind, an ordinary night. But simple explanations are often the last thing people hold on to before they understand that something has already started to tilt. The news spread quickly. Two strangers in Sodom, taken in for the night, not outside the walls, not in the camp, not under the open sky, inside a house. The news did not move loudly through the streets. It slid underneath them, from mouth to mouth, roof to roof, courtyard to courtyard. Eliab heard it first in what disappeared. A shutter closed, then another. A woman drew water faster than usual from the cistern and vanished without setting the bucket down. A boy who had been dragging a stick through the dust was pulled inside without a word. Sodom was not quiet, but it was becoming careful. A shop remained half open above the street. No one below kept arguing over the price of a jar. The rope at the well gave one long squeal and then stopped. When Eliab looked toward the roof lines, there was not a single bird. No circling, nothing. Only that rigid dusk over stone and dust. And again, he thought about the dogs. You only hear it once. At first, the sentence meant almost nothing to him. Just a thought. Something an old gatekeeper might say about animals that feel a change in the weather. Later, it would mean something else. Eliab had guarded that gate for 40 years. And some nights he no longer knew whether he had protected a city or only its silence. A city reveals itself not by its walls, but by what it does to the weak when no one is looking. And Sodom had already failed that test, not in one night, not by one act, but slowly, in nights when travelers disappeared and no one asked where they had gone by morning, in courtyards where servants washed blood out of cracks before sunrise, in houses where bread was left over while hunger waited outside, in alleys where a scream was heard and no door opened. Eliab had seen all of it, too often, and that was what made the two strangers dangerous, not because they were armed, not because they were loud, but because their presence would force the city to reveal what it really was. When the night sank deeper, Eliab heard the footsteps. He did not need to see the crowd yet. He knew that kind of walking, not drunken, not scattered, not aimless, deliberate. They gathered in the alley outside the house that had taken the strangers in. And the first men there were not the desperate ones, not the cast-offs, not men with nothing left to lose. They were men with standing. Men with good belts, clean sandals, cloaks worn by the kind of men who never carried what other men hauled for them. They stood too neatly to be out of control. That was the disturbing part. One of them raised a hand and knocked on the door. Not hard, almost calm. Then again. The wood answered with a dull sound. No one in the alley looked surprised. No one asked why a house was being surrounded in the middle of the night. No one said guests were under protection. Eliab stood at the edge of the street and looked into faces he had known for years. And for the first time, he saw them clearly. Not as citizens, not as men of the city, but as what Sodom had made of them. Then one of them said, in a voice so gentle it was worse because of it, "Whoever enters this city belongs to the city." No shouting followed, no protest, only agreement, heavy and quiet as dust. And that was the real horror, not the sky, not the fire that would come later, but the fact that this city no longer knew what protection meant. Then something happened that did not belong to the alley. A tremor passed through the ground, not strong, just fine, brief, almost too subtle to trust. A jar hanging against the wall rattled. Dust slipped from a crack. One of the men frowned and shifted his footing as if the stone under him had stored heat. The explanations came immediately. Heat in the rock, the salt fields shifting. This ground was always a little restless. Eliab said nothing. He knew that game. Explanations are often just cloth thrown over an opening so people do not have to look down into it. Someone struck the door again, harder this time. There was still light inside the house. The pressure in the alley rose, and somewhere beyond the roofs, Eliab thought he saw a glow, not red, not like fire, brighter, colder, almost white. He blinked. It stayed there, and in that moment, he understood that fire would not be the worst thing. But that was only part of the truth, because Sodom had not fallen that night for the first time. It had fallen in every night before it, in every house where a stranger was seen as prey instead of a person, in every courtyard where power weighed more than right, in every storehouse that stayed locked while hunger waited outside, in every alley where cruelty no longer felt strange. The catastrophe did not begin in the sky. It began where no one flinched anymore. Maybe that was the real judgment on Sodom. Not that the city was evil, but that one day it had mistaken its own evil for order. The pounding on the door grew harder. Not frantic, certain. That is how someone knocks when he thinks he has a right to whatever is inside. More men turned into the alley, then more. They did not become fewer. They became many, On the roofs above, shadows appeared. No witnesses, only eyes. Sodom was watching, and by watching, it was already helping. Then the tremor came back, longer this time. A deep rolling moved through the ground, low and distant, as if something under the streets had answered when it should not have been there at all. One man at the door stopped in the middle of a sentence. Another looked down at his hand because fine dust had fallen across it. A third turned south toward the darkness that had been solid only moments before. Now the glow was there again, clearer, white, not like flames, more like light burning behind a curtain of stone. And then Eliab understood something that tightened his throat. These men were not afraid of what they were about to do. They were only afraid that something greater might see them doing it. Inside the house, something moved, not in panic, quickly. A shadow behind the door, then another at the roofline. A short call Eliab did not understand. Suddenly the wood struck from the inside, not opening, only holding, as if someone inside knew that the line between inside and outside was the last line left. Then it happened. A scream, short, broken off, not like the cry of a man being attacked, more like the sound a person makes when he sees something and understands at the same moment that it was never meant for human eyes. Several men stumbled back. One clutched at his face, another hit the wall. A third reached blindly for the arm of the man beside him. The order in the alley broke, not into chaos, not yet, into something worse, uncertainty. And this is where it turned, because a violent crowd is predictable as long as it feels certain. The moment it begins to doubt, every wall, every door, every movement becomes a threat. Eliab's body decided before his mind did. He turned and ran, not out of cowardice, but because some old men know the exact moment a city can no longer be held together. In a side alley, he seized a boy by the arm. The child had been standing frozen, staring toward the house. "Come." The boy did not resist. Behind them, Eliab no longer heard words. Only pressure, only footsteps, only that deep, restrained sound in the ground, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. They reached the gate just as the light tore open above the roofs. If you had been standing there, you would not have seen it first. You would have heard it, like timber breaking in 100 places at once, like stone splitting open, like the air above the city had been pulled tight for hours and suddenly gave way. Dust rose from the streets, then steam, then something pale that looked like ash for a moment, and in the next moment fell heavier, sharper, drier, stranger. White light moved over the roofs without a sound. The shock came after, deep, all the way into the teeth. Eliab staggered out through the gate onto the pale plain. The boy stumbled beside him. Behind them, others ran into the dust, some barefoot, some wrapped in nothing but cloth, some empty-handed, because even terror needs a moment to decide what no longer matters. The air cut the throat. Every breath hurt. Behind them, Sodom was no longer a city, only shape, dust, blinding light, a fracture of stone and glare, and far enough beyond it, almost lost in the same white distance, Gomorrah lay inside the same breath. Then Eliab remembered the first sentence of that night. The dogs were silent. Now it no longer sounded like an observation. Now it sounded like a verdict. You only hear it once. And now the phrase meant something different. Not the silence of animals. The last moment a city is warned before it can no longer recognize itself. They climbed higher, away from the walls, away from the cisterns, away from everything that still belonged to Sodom. The ground still trembled faintly under their feet. Then came the largest shock of the night. not like thunder, near and far at the same time. For one moment, everything turned white. The dust, the rocks, the lines in Eliab's hands, the film of salt on the boy's skin. And in that light, something happened that people always do when their whole life is breaking behind them. Someone looked back, not for long, not bravely, not even fully, only far enough to touch what was being lost one last time with the eyes. Maybe a house, maybe a voice, maybe only the desperate hope that something which had stood so long could not vanish in a single night. But some losses punish even the glance. The figure stopped. Dust settled over cloth, hair and skin. The pale layer caught first on the lashes, then on the lips, then on the hands, which no longer moved free of each other. For a moment, the person still looked upright, then not like someone pausing, like someone the night itself had taken hold of. The boy beside Eliab said nothing. Eliab said nothing either, because there are images in front of which every word becomes too small. When morning came, the plain was not black. It was brighter than before, as if a dead layer had settled over everything. Where walls had stood, broken light lay across dust and cracks. Heat still rose from some of the openings. The air tasted bitter. Not a single bird had returned. There was almost nothing left of Sodom, less of Gomorrah. The boy stared for a long time at what remained, and then, with a dry voice, asked what had really happened that night. Was it fire? Was it something rising out of the earth? Was it both at once? Eliab did not answer immediately. He only looked at the tracks in the dust, several lines of feet leading away from the city, and in the middle of them, a gap, as if even the ground remembered where one person had not gone any farther. Then he said quietly, "A city can stand for a long time after it is already lost." And suddenly, the real mystery was no longer the destruction. It was how long it had gone unnoticed before that. When the two strangers entered through the gate, the dogs stayed silent. Maybe that was never a sign of what was coming. Maybe it was a sign of what Sodom had already become. You only hear it once, and some cities do not fall in fire. They fall long before it. Subscribe to Forgotten Paths. Some places are still waiting to be remembered.